So now let's move on to discussing the media. We are first going to talk about learning in the media broadly, then talk about violence and sex in the media. Now, there are many different forms of media, and there have been, even most recently, large increases in the number of tablets and smart mobile devices in the homes of children, especially those under the age of 8, 40% and 75% respectively in 2013. And despite this, television is still the predominant mode of consumption for media. Half of time spent with media for adolescents and children is on TV, 20% of the time DVDs, 13% mobile devices, 10% computers, and 9% video games. However, we don't have much research on this. The American Association of Pediatrics has said that, quote, compared to other areas in health and education, research on the effects of media use on very young children has not been a consistent funding priority for the federal government, foundations, or academic institutions, end quote. And while some say it might not be a big deal, there do seem to be long-term effects. For example, let's think about how you feel towards the movie The Little Mermaid. Might sound like an odd question, but just for 1 second, think about what do you think? Generally positive or generally negative? Well, you might not really think much about it at the time and might not have when you first saw the movie if you have seen the movie. But you probably didn't think if you should be questioning whether a 16-year-old mute girl who's marooned and taken advantage of by a strange man is a good topic for girls to be watching, or boys for that matter too. And listen to the lyrics from one of the songs. Quote, yes, you want her, look at her, you know you do. It's possible she wants you too. There is only one way to ask her. It don't take a word, not a single word. Go on and kiss the girl. End quote. So in this song, Sebastian the Crab is singing, says, you don't have to talk, just kiss her. One study actually looked at The Little Mermaid specifically and found that people resisted any kind of negative criticism of it despite this problematic content. So if you're someone who really likes The Little Mermaid and you hear me kind of criticizing it and you're saying to yourself, I don't really buy it, well, that might not be the greatest thing. Adolescents spend even more time than children, 7 hours a day for 7 to 18-year-olds, with more than 4 hours spent on music at more than 2 hours, 4 to 4.5 hours on TV, 2 to 3 on music, and less on computer and video games. Among adolescents with a TV in their bedroom, the average goes up to 11 hours a day. That is crazy. And this has implications for obesity, it doubles the risk of smoking, diminishes sleep quality, and there are also racial and ethnic differences. Black and Hispanic children spend 5 to 6 hours a day, whereas whites it's about 3.5. We also see that TV shows are being viewed differently now. 40% of the time it's on computers or phones, and we really don't know what this means yet, because we don't have long-term longitudinal studies, as we'll get into shortly. Texting has also increased. The average 13 to 17-year-old sends, in one study, it was 3,364 texts a month. Half of kids sent 50 or more per day, and a third spent 100 or more per day. There are gender differences here as well. Boys send and receive about 30 on average, and girls about 80. And this is not necessarily a bad thing, but there can be problems. About a quarter of teens say they've been bullied via texting or phones. And we'll talk about sexting in a little while, but 4% say they've sent nude pictures, but 15% say they've received them, which means that probably more of them have sent it and probably fewer of them have received it. So, preschoolers, we're going to start young. Preschoolers watch a lot of television. They consume a lot of media, but especially television, 3 to 4 hours of TV per day. And this time has gone up even in the past 15 to 20 years. 1/3 of households with children ages 2 to 7 say that the TV is on most of the time in their homes. Additionally, only about 3/4 of an hour is the average amount of reading time that these children have. And if you think about it and want to be kind of skeptical, that 3/4 of an hour reading average is probably a little inflated since people want to sound like they're doing it a lot, whereas the TV might actually be even higher than what they say because people don't want to admit their kids are watching it all day. Computers are also big. Those who use computers, generally speaking, use them an hour a day, mostly by themselves. A fifth of 4 to 6 year olds have sent an email before. But for the purposes of our talk today, computers are really too recent for us to have a good understanding. Tablets, the same way, even mobile phones, honestly are a bit too new for us to understand. Remember back to developmental methodology lecture. We like, as developmental psychologists, having long longitudinal data sets. So we could track to see how people are interacting with materials for long periods of time and what the long-term impacts are. So many of the things, the breaking new technologies we have are just too recent for us to understand. But television, we have a better understanding of. Movies, we have a better understanding of. So the first thing to talk about is just pose a couple questions to you guys. And after I pose them, just I'd like you to pause the presentation and just think about it for a minute or two. And that is, what do you think of children watching TV? What effect do you think it might have? Did you watch TV? Would you let your children watch TV? Should we allow marketing to children on TV? In general, what role should TV have in a child's life? And how much should it change? So go ahead and just pause for a minute or two. The American Association of Pediatrics says TV should be limited, and until age 2, children should watch 0 television. And then following that, they should watch no more than 1 to 2 hours of quality programming a day. And we're going to talk about what quality programming is in a little while. But first, let's just think about what's happening with kids when they are watching TV. Well, first of all, they're watching the screen. We have a pretty good sense that they don't fully understand the plots of stories they're watching, in particular the longer ones. That's why many kids' TV shows, even now, are just 15 minutes long as opposed to the typical half an hour one. And we know this because when children are asked about shows they've watched, they are generally unable to even recall significant story details. Their inferences about why things have happened are often wrong. Sometimes they have difficulty separating the TV from the real world. There's actually a large percentage of kids who really believe there is a big bird who lives on a street called Sesame Street. They're also unable to understand parts of advertising, but not all of it. Oftentimes, they fully accept advertisers' claims. I remember as a kid, Cookie Crisp. I don't even know if that's still around, but they were just like little mini cookies you could have as your cereal. Cookie Crisp was part of a complete balanced breakfast. That means it's healthy, right? So why can't I have it? I remember thinking along those lines, or at least maybe it was just wishful thinking. The APA has actually recommended banning advertising to children under age 8. But if we also think further about what's going through a kid's mind when they're watching television, and even more than that, what they're not doing when they're watching TV. So when a child is watching television, they're typically not interacting with the environment. And if you think back to Piaget, he thought that most of what children needed to do was interact with their environment, the physical environment, especially when they're young. They need to learn with their hands. They need to play with things physically that they have, not just stare at something. And even if we think about it from an evolutionary theory, television and things like that are so new that our bodies, our brains are not wired from an evolutionary perspective to kind of handle these things. So what is good television? Well, I want to try to give you an example of not good television first. And give me 1 second. Here we go.
Time. Hey everyone, it's lunchtime. Time to eat.
Whoa, excuse me.
Hello friends, it's lunchtime. Hey everyone, it's lunchtime. Time to eat. Here you go, Groby. Time to eat.
I'm gonna eat, yeah. Yummy, yummy, gonna eat, yeah. Yummy, yummy, chicken, yeah. In my tummy, party, party, yeah. In my tummy, cheese, yeah. In my tummy, party, party, yeah. In my tummy, juice, yeah. In my tummy, yeah. So there's a party in my tummy. Now there's a party in my
I hope
tummy.
this song gets stuck in your head. So this is Yo Gabba Gabba. It's a children's television show on Nickelodeon. And right now, this furry creature is singing about a party in his tummy food is going to. And as you'll see here,
Why are you sad?
We want to go to the party. The party in your tummy.
Carrots want to go to the party.
there is
in my
ostensibly
tummy?
some educational material here that carrots and asparagus or green beans or whatever also want to go to the party in their tummy. So maybe it's a good thing to eat the vegetables as well. But that's kind of a stretch. For you and I, we might be able to make that out. But children, I'm unsure if they would understand what the purpose of that is. So, Sesame Street is actually thought to be a pretty good show for kids. About half of preschoolers watch Sesame Street. I'm pretty sure I did. And it seems that Sesame Street does help. I'm just going to read a couple pieces of evidence that have been found. 3 and 5-year-old children who watched Sesame Street had larger vocabularies than those who watched other TV and no TV, meaning watching Sesame Street was better than not watching television at all, which is interesting. Also, it's been found that those in lower income environments are better prepared for school if they watch it, and that they perform better on some measures of verbal and math abilities at age 6 and 7 than those who didn't watch it. Those who watch it are also viewed more positively by teachers. It seems like they might learn manners, the proper way to behave that way. And there has been some evidence that other shows like Dora the Explorer and Blue's Clues have similar positive gains, but I've actually seen conflicting evidence. But for Sesame Street, it actually seems to be pretty straightforward. Now, some people do say there could be some bad things, even with Sesame Street, that kids could be too frantic and be less receptive to traditional schooling. However, I've not seen evidence of this. And if you watch a clip of Sesame Street, oftentimes you have the count saying, "What is this? 1. 1." I mean, first of all, I know that's a wonderful impression of the count, but it's very slow paced. It's something that the kids can understand. They're not getting into something too in depth that they might not be able to understand. So, let's talk about violence in the media, one of the more controversial aspects. So, one well-cited study from 2000 looked at all 74 G-rated animated feature films released between 1937 and 1999 that they could get. All of the 74 films had at least one act of violence in them, where violence is defined as intentional acts where the aggressor makes some physical contact that has the potential to inflict injury or harm, and did not include accidents. Over time, the length of violence has increased in these. Since the 1930s, films have had longer and longer periods of violence in them. And of the 125 injuries that they found, 62 of them were fatal. and the majority of films had a fatal injury in them. Characters who were portrayed as bad in them were much more likely to die than other characters. And you might think that this is a good thing at first. However, the majority of violence came from good characters, or neutral characters, dealing damage to bad characters in all but 2 cases. And this means that the good people were using violence as a means of reaching conflict resolution. This sends potentially, and we'll see what we think about this in a little while, but this potentially sends a message that even good people use violence, and it's okay, and it works. And the method that was used in violence, guns were used in 35% of films, knives, swords, other sharp objects, 53%. But it wasn't just those. Actually, everyone had some kind of violent act with a body part, and usually fists. What about video games? Well, before we get into some theories about violent video games, let's look at E-rated video games, which is conceptually analogous to G-rated movies. And one study looked at games from 1985 to 2000, found that 64% of games had intentional violence, totaling almost 31% of gameplay, and 60% of the time injuring characters was rewarded or required. So even in games for children, there's a lot of violence, and it's being rewarded. Think about what that sends from a social learning theory perspective. So violence and video games. This is also very controversial. Approximately 97% of adolescents, 12 to 17, play some types of video games. And you just might think that's kind of high. That can include games on your phones. It can include basically anything. About a third of adolescents play on a daily basis, 20%, 3 to 5 times a week. More than half of kids play violent video games. And half of the most frequently played games are violent. This violent media are disproportionately targeted towards boys. And there's much debate over this link between violent video games and aggression. So generally speaking, there is a positive correlation between violent video games and aggression in adolescents and adults alike. Similarly, playing them makes you temporarily more aggressive in behavior, cognition, affect, and physiological arousal. And the effect sizes are from about 0.15 to 0.25, which is in the small range. However, there's a difference in how to interpret effect sizes and their harmful effects. While there might be a small effect size, if this is happening in most adolescents across the country, the practical effect could actually be pretty big. There is less evidence to support the long-term relationship, in part because of the few longitudinal studies that have been done. But to be really clear on what the effects are, you would have a person play a violent video game at one point in time, and you could potentially have them play it for long periods of time and then see 20 years later what happens to them. But people aren't playing the same games, and because of the increases in technology, we are not even playing like the similar types of games. Back in the day, Mario for the Super Nintendo, that was actually a game, one of the games that was out like when I was very young. The Nintendo 64 was out when I was young. Those are very different than what we're seeing today with like the Call of Duties of the world. So let's talk about some of the theories. So the first one, social learning theory. We've talked about this before. If you play violent video games, the theory goes that you might imitate aggression. And this is in Bandura's work. So this is fairly straightforward. We've gone over it before. We don't need to go over it too much more. The second theory is excitation transfer theory. And this says that there is a transfer of physiological arousal that might be how the link between violent video game play and aggression occurs. In particular, the theory says that when you are playing a game, you become physiologically aroused. You're on edge. If you watch someone really get into a video game, they oftentimes will be leaning forward in their chair, they'll be tensing up a little bit, and that physiological arousal can continue even after the game stops, and can transfer also to future times playing the game because you've learned that that's physiologically what you do, and your body just kind of automatically does that again later when you play the game again. The third theory is the cognitive neo-association model. And this says that playing violent games creates or activates networks of aggressive thoughts, emotions, and memories in the brain. That literally the neural connections that go from aggressive, that activate aggression, they are activated and therefore strengthened. You use them more, they become more strengthened. That's how we believe neurons work, after all. Thus, violent video games can influence aggressive behavior by spreading this activation of aggressive networks through your brain. The fourth is the most well supported. It's Anderson and Bushman's General Aggression Model, GAM, General Aggression Model. It's the most well supported. And what they say is that long-term repeated exposure to violent video games may influence aggressive behavior by promoting aggressive beliefs and attitudes, such as creating normative beliefs about aggression. So long-term repeated exposure to violent video games can influence behavior by promoting aggressive beliefs and attitudes. Additionally, violent video games can create aggressive behavioral scripts or expectations. So for example, people can have a hostile attributional bias where people interpret ambiguous situations as hostile. So in some video games, for those of you who have ever played or seen played a game like Grand Theft Auto, it can actually be rewarded for you to shoot first and ask questions later. If there's someone who's around who could potentially be violent towards you, oftentimes it is rewarded for you to be violent towards them, be aggressive towards them. And so if you start to learn that in these ambiguous situations, it could go either way, that you should be hostile, you can learn that not just there, but other places as well. So this causes violent video game players to be more likely to react aggressively to unintentional provocations, like bumping into someone or being cut off in traffic accidentally. And the thought is that people's personalities can then become biased towards aggression. So, in sum, each violent video game episode can reinforce the notion that aggression is an effective and appropriate way to deal with conflict and anger. Now, this is not universally accepted. Other people might point away from the violence and more towards competition and the pace of the game, where competition itself can increase physiological arousal, which might cause aggression. There's a hypothesis called Berkowitz's frustration-aggression hypothesis, where competition influences frustration in a losing player who can increase aggressive behavior. I know some of the times I've got most upset playing video games was playing Tetris when I've almost got my high score and then lose. So aggression might be learned as a way to deal with competition and frustration. It might not actually be anything to do with the violence itself. So what do some longitudinal studies say about this? Well, one study looked at 4th and 5th graders, and they found that 6 months after their initial study, they found increases in physical and verbal aggression and lower prosocial behavior in individuals who played violent video games. Another study, German adolescents. Those who were exposed predicted direct aggression at a second time, a later time. Japanese adolescents, higher video game play led to higher aggression 3 to 6 months later. Another study, 12 to 15-year-olds found this time no increase in violence over 2 years. So there does seem to be some contradictory evidence. Now, there are limitations to these studies. These are all 2 years or less in follow-up. Also, they don't look at video game play at both times to see if their level of consumption has changed. Basically, are you playing more earlier than later? Is playing it at the beginning what's important? Is sustaining video game play what is doing it? And these studies also don't look at the opposite direction of causality, which is key here to some people, and that is a selection hypothesis. Meaning that it's not that violent video games cause aggression, but rather that people who are more aggressive play more violent video games. And there's also mixed evidence for this hypothesis when people have looked at it. More recently, though, in the last year, what seems to me to be the best study has shown that there is a link between violent video game play and aggressive behavior throughout high school. This was a study in about 1,500 Canadian high schoolers. And even after controlling for non-violent video game play, overall video game play, gender, parental education, academics, depression, delay of gratification, peer deviance, friendship quality, parental relationship quality, parental control, and school culture, there was an effect, although that was small. You don't need to know all of those. That's why I went through it so quickly, but just get the point that they were very, very thorough in taking into account a ton of variables, and they did find something, but a relatively small effect. And also, they found no evidence for a selection hypothesis. There was more violent people who were playing these games. Okay, so let's look at some types of interventions to see how those might influence aggression. There are, generally speaking, two types of interventions. The first one is called restricted consuming, and the second is critical consuming. So restricted consuming looks at a reduction in media exposure, and they substitute violent with non-violent material. So reduction in media exposure. Critical consuming, on the other hand, looks at the promotion of and understanding of how media influences people and the mechanisms by which violence is presented. Essentially, they walk people through how to properly analyze media. Now, past studies are mixed as to the effects of these interventions in elementary children. Results also vary by gender, and little is known about the long-term effects of these interventions, and they're primarily targeted in elementary children. So how good would they be at critically consuming it based on their cognitive development in elementary school? I'm unsure. Other interventions have done things like trying to get kids to keep a media consumption log, and then asked families and children to have a media-free weekend and schedule alternative activities. But these are difficult to say that there's going to be a long-term effect, because if you stop people playing it for one weekend, unless you do it long-term, is that really going to stop things? Is one weekend less of violent video game play going to do anything long-term? I'm skeptical. Critical consuming interventions oftentimes will show people clips from media that are less real life, so they can be examples. They're then discussed in a class so students can identify features of violence. It can also involve parents, can send newsletters to parents about rating systems, age rating systems, guidelines for media diets, exposure, strategies to monitor. But all of these things have mixed to limited evidence. So One thing that I want you to think about while we're doing this and talking about this is A, how do we measure aggression in all of these studies? And B, how much should we take into account the past studies given that there's such an increase in technological um, or there's so many technological advances in the realism of many of these games. Okay, so now let's move to sex in the media. A real quick quote: media have arguably become the leading sex educator in the US today. I think with the concerns that many family members have about how schools do sex education, this is probably correct. And there is evidence that media influence attitudes about sex, beliefs about sex, but also the onset of sexual activity. Now, I haven't seen a more recent study, but the one that I'm going to cite says that 75% of primetime TV programs had sexual content, and only 14% of those had any kinds of risks. And prior to that, sexual content had increased in the past decades, so it's reasonable to think that it is minimally as high currently, or even higher than in past years. And interestingly, teen TV shows show more sex than adult ones. And I suppose this could be adult shows are CSI and cooking shows versus MTV for kids, but Also, among the top 25 highest rated primetime series among teenagers, teen females were engaged in sexual behavior in 47% of them, while adult women only 29% of the time. Apparently, teen magazines still exist and on average spend more than 2.5 pages on sexual topics, with the largest subject being the loss of virginity. So this is a very widespread issue. The expansion of the internet into adolescent lives has also increased the viewing of pornography. Now, many of these studies are hard to do ethically, and it's hard to get people to buy into doing them, but I digress. Many studies show that almost all teens have seen some X-rated films by self-report. And like I said, it's difficult or impossible to do this since it's all self-report and it's hard to get permission. However, we have found that viewing violent pornography leads to increases in sexually aggressive behavior. Exposure to X-rated material leads to increased risk of early sex and oral sex. There's increases in sexual preoccupation among those who view pornography, and an increase in likelihood of having multiple lifetime sexual partners, and general permissiveness in those who watch, adolescents at least, who watch X-rated movies. In addition to this, contraceptives are a difficult topic in the media. The media portrays sex all the time, but they don't discuss birth control. It's rarely discussed in TV shows. And media companies are at fault too. CBS and Fox, at least the last time I saw, won't show ads for condoms unless they pertain directly to HIV/AIDS and not to pregnancy. Sexting is a new thing. It is a difficult topic because of how sexting is defined. Is it sending photos, receiving them? Is it sexual content in text, messages themselves? Generally, the percentages of adolescents who have engaged in this go from somewhere around 4% to 45%, so it's a huge range. And is it a problem? Well, some states have actually tried teens as sexual offenders under pornography laws. So practically, yes. Some places it's only a misdemeanor. Some have decriminalized it fully. But other than the practical legal consequences, there's very little research in this. But some people have found that not all of the information is bad. There are some outlets that try to send text messages about safe sex information. There are some games that can help make children reduce pregnancy by giving them virtual children, things like that. And there also, in general, technology has allowed for more anonymous sources of information about STDs. So while there are the bad parts, there are also the good parts. So is media good or bad? Well, it's a more difficult question than just that. And if anything from this semester, you'll probably learn that I am big into methodology and will bash you over the head with that. But just think about how difficult it is to do many of these studies that we're interested in. It's hard, very hard to do it. And also that this is such a, it's so prevalent in society and will be increasingly for kids. Will you want your kids to have access to a phone that has internet access? At what age? Will you monitor it? All of these things are issues that you will have to come up with at some point in your life.